Philip, I'm not surprised that Trump went after McConnell the way he did, but as we try to assess where this version of the Republican Party is headed, what does it say about Trump's influence and how, if you were some of the Republican senators that are still cozying up to him, who were down there in Florida, how can you maintain both a loyalty to Donald Trump and a loyalty to Mitch McConnell, who you're going to need if you're up for re-election?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, this is the same dance that Republicans have been engaged in for the past 5 years, right? And this is Republicans are having to deal with a President Trump who is going solo, saying his own things, still commands a strong support from the Republican base, but they still need to do what they have been doing, right? Which is to try and work with McConnell to pass legislation. I don't think, unless you were just elected in 2020 and starting in 2021, you're probably pretty used to this by now, right? And I don't know as well. I mean, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is while this is familiar to them, Donald Trump's position is much diminished after his having left office. It is not the case that he's on Twitter. He's not going to rail against you on Twitter or on Facebook right now. He may send out one of his, little press releases that ends up on Twitter via his staff anyway. But it's just the threat isn't quite the same. And so I think we're starting to see some of the reaction here is a lot of here we go again, as opposed to shaking in their boots.
Right. I mean, Sahil, I take Philip's point that they may be accustomed to it, that this might be the same dance that they've been doing for a very long time. The difference is now that we're watching how that is playing out legislatively, given that we have a Democratic president and the possibility of legislation actually moving through Congress. So that to me seems to be part of what has changed. In addition to that, you have Trump going after Mike Pence, as I said, saying he was disappointed in his former VP. That, again, on its face, not surprising to me, Sahil, but notable that it happened the same day that you had the AP reporting that Pence tried to assert control at the Capitol on January 6th. If these Republicans are trying to avoid a primary in 2022 or trying to stay in the mix for 2024, there are a lot of names who are there that we know have their eye on 2024. Shouldn't the lack of loyalty to Mike Pence from Donald Trump be a cautionary tale to them?
It should be, and it is a credible threat from the former president, but studiously loyal, effusively loyal at times to Donald Trump. And he seems to be on the outs now very clearly because he did not go along with an effort to essentially overturn the result of an election, which Mike Pence didn't have the power to do as vice president anyway. And this does put a number of Republicans in a box, including those who are up for re-election in 2022. Senators like John Thune, who are caught between that loyalty to McConnell and loyalty to Trump. It's going to be a tricky needle for him to thread. He has not even announced if he's going to run. He is the number 2 Republican in the Senate. There are others like Chuck Grassley who have not announced. In addition to that, any Republican who wants to run for president in 2024 is going to have to deal with throngs of who, according to poll after poll after poll, overwhelmingly support Donald Trump to be on the ballot again and want him to be their nominee again. It's not clear that Donald Trump will run again in 2024 for president, but he will either do that or try to play a kingmaker role in the party. He started off the first few months of the Biden presidency pretty quiet, but he's dialing up the political operation a little more lately with more and more statements.
So, Juanita, Philip, Sahil, they both laid out sort of what Republicans are up against, what the equation is for them. This event in Mar-a-Lago was a big donor event. Instead of talking, though, about how to win back the White House and Congress, you have the former president focusing on his grievances, on retribution. One attendee told Politico the speech was, quote, horrible, long, and dour. It didn't focus on the positive things that Trump had done. I mean, there's just, as usual, no real strategy here. And I wonder, Juanita, both how that complicates Republican attempts to convince donors that their dollars are actually going towards any type of strategy, and also, when you flip that, how Democrats take advantage of that void.
Look, Alicia, it's deeply complex and is honestly like a messy relationship where no party wants to be there. We know the Republican Party doesn't want anything to do with Trump and meddling in their leadership. And we know that Trump is only using this platform because he knows that registered Republican voters are what allows him to flex his muscle on the Republican Party like he just did. And so what I think we're going to see next is this competition that's going to continue, where you have the Republican infrastructure trying to raise money, trying to set up operations looking to 2022, and Trump is going to continue to be a foil for them. It's not something that they're going to be able to get rid of, especially when I think it was recently reported that he has raised more than the RNC recently for his new projects and his new ventures. And so Trump is not going away for this Republican Party. I think what we can expect is more of this infighting, because what he's doing is creating distractions and diversions for the Republican Party, which are absolutely going to continue to show up in 2022 as he continues to endorse primary challengers and create issues for Republicans who are seeking re-election, like Murkowski or like the Georgia State Secretary Raffensperger. He is ready to be here, and I don't think the Republican Party is going to be able to shake him.
Phil, part of why I find this all interesting when you zoom out is because we know that we are watching a political realignment here, and some of those contours are still coming into focus well after the 2020 election. So, for example, your colleagues at the Post reporting today that you have more than 100 corporate executives holding a call to discuss halting donations and investments to counter the controversial voting bills that are being passed across the country. There's been a lot of attention in Georgia, but it's also happening in Texas and Arizona, Florida. Pretty significant, big news. I mean, both, how do you see corporate America's advocacy impacting the voting rights agenda? We've already seen in some states that begin to modulate what they're doing based on what they saw coming out of Georgia. But also, how does it position the Republican Party if you have corporate executives lining up across to counter them?
Well, a couple things. The first is that you're right. We have seen, I think an under-recognized point is that the Georgia law which passed was much less severe than the law which was originally proposed. And that was largely a function of public pressure. I don't know that that was necessarily primarily corporate pressure, but obviously there was corporate pressure that has been brought to bear on Georgia, and which I think a lot of other states are going to look at. Part of that absolutely is the fact that the nature of corporate America's relationship with politics is changing for a variety of reasons, including that corporate employees are more active in demanding that their leadership take a role, and because the leaders themselves tend to be more college educated and of the type of person or American which is already shifting to the left, as we've seen over the course of the past 4 or 5 years. But at its core, what we're seeing right now is a party that in 2020 made the decision to just simply say, we're fully on board with Donald Trump's agenda and don't have an agenda of our own. And so what that means, and that's literally, right? I mean, we all know that there was no party platform in 2020 beyond whatever Donald Trump says goes, essentially. And so what they're doing is now, because they don't have their own platform, because they don't have their own identity of what they want to be driving forward, they're still being reactive to what Donald Trump is saying. And so what is he saying? He's saying the election was stolen, which is obviously very much not true, but they're still responding to that because that's what the base expects them to say. What they're trying to do, too, is pivot on corporations, say, well, we're now the working class party and the Democrats are the party of corporations. If that is the realignment that they actually want to have happen, which I'm sure Mitch McConnell is not enthusiastic about, it's going to take a while before they actually get there.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.